20. Now, good afternoon to everybody. And I'm Peter Erdi. I'm sitting now in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And I have the chance to make the second part of our podcast with Brian Castellani, who is sitting now in Durham, England, and Lasse Gerrits, who is hopefully sitting in Rotterdam, right?
That's correct.
The Netherlands. And the topic of our conversation now is from complex social psychology to collective behavior, social movements, and mass psychology. This is a huge book, so we cannot make podcasts about the whole, but I believe this part reflects well the whole spirit of their approach. And I would like to start the conversation about the cybernetic approach to psychology. When I'm speaking about cybernetics, I'm also speaking about the second order cybernetics, and you addressed both topics. So the ball is on your court, Brian and Lasse.
Yeah, well, thanks, Peter, for doing this and doing a second podcast. So if you look at our map of the complexity sciences, you'll see that even in that map, the two most consistent strands moving across are system science and then also cybernetics. I think cybernetics offers psychology a lot. And I'll defer to Lasse to talk more about the sociology of it. But I think as far as psychology goes, you have your second order cybernetics, right, which is this notion that you're interacting with systems that can interact back and can reflect. And then socio-cybernetics, moving to the way in which cybernetics plays itself out in social systems that are complex, filled with power, all sorts of complex interactions and so forth. So I think there's a definite cybernetic, there's lots that cybernetics can offer psychology, particularly in the book we talk about therapy, synchronization, and the way in which a therapist and a patient begin to get on the same trajectories, begin to basically come into symmetry with each other, the way reflecting is done on the part of the therapist's part and so forth. And then Wallisher and others have really developed this into social psychology as well, Wallisher, looking at the way in which societies begin to synchronize, right? We have this in social media. We see a lot, for example, certainly in the work you've done, Peter, around ranking and the ways in which things are distributed. So yeah, I definitely think there's a tradition there. I think the challenge, though, is because so much of it is mathematically grounded. I think that has put a lot of cybernetics at a distance from, say, your average social scientist who's qualitative. But there's still a lot that can be done with it qualitatively as well. And a lot of people in the world of group family systems theory, family systems therapy, Gestalt group psychology have really used these principles in a more metaphoric way to understand patient dynamics, nonlinearity, feedback, and so forth. So I'll pass it over to Lasse to build on that.
Yeah, no, certainly. And within the social sciences, larger sociology, I would say there's sort of a wave of discovering cybernetics, and then it disappears for a while, and then it's someone that rediscovers it, and then there's another wave of enthusiasm. And I think it is definitely what Brian just said, that sociologists do understand that that society has systemic properties. I think where the difficulty lies in how to make it work. So how does that whole thing work? And then we get into the more technical side of cybernetics, which for many people will be difficult. Not necessarily because it is technical, but rather because it forces you to bring very ambiguous concepts and ideas into very clear terms, and that does not always work. And therefore, that I think explains sort of these waves of discovery, disappointment, rediscovery, try again. Ultimately, probably the value lies there also in the metaphorical sense than not necessarily in tracing all the different aspects, all the different loops, all the different concepts there. But I guess that ultimately it is understood to be of value. The question is just, how does one do this?
Thank you. And so before going into the details of discussing social psychology and psychological social psychology, as you called, I would like to ask a somewhat provocative question. Of course, we are all of us interested in computational social science, is an emerging field, and you are more social scientist, so probably you will kill me and we will not be able to continue the recording. So I like to tell in the classroom that society is too serious to leave it for social scientists, or even worse, for politicians. How do you feel this somewhat malignant comment?
Well, I think we shouldn't kill you, because we still need you to host this whole thing. So I would say that I mean, obviously it is a provocation, but nowadays I tend to agree, at least on the part when it comes to politicians. There's definitely a good point. Then on the social scientist part, I would argue that I sympathize with people who struggle to put all these different, sometimes mathematical and sometimes computational ideas into the practice, and that there are strands within the social sciences that just simply do not allow for it, because they are much more grounded in fieldwork in ethnography or anthropology. I think the challenge for us is not to discard one or the other, but to bring these two things together, or to bring all these different strands together and see in what ways they can inform each other. But I do have a great deal of sympathy for social scientists who try alternative ways, whether that is cybernetics or complex systems or very different radical anthropological approaches. I think we're all trying to sort of navigate around this murky basement called society, and we just do it in different ways. But there's value in all of them, though. Of course, we wrote this book on complexity sciences, and I think that's where Brian and I really want to put the emphasis. Or correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, then you may have to kill two people in the podcast today.
No, I think so. I also wanted to just go very quickly back to the first question, if I may, Peter, is also to point out, from Parsons to Luhmann to Castells, the core definition of cybernetics being control and information in society, we live in a world that is entirely cybernetic. So just to point that out, even going at a global level, and now with AI, we're completely in signal to noise sorts of issues in terms of the quality of information movement, and sociologists and social scientists should be really get involved in that. And I think it then segues right into my answer to the second question, which is part of the reason, again, I won't speak for you, Lasse, but part of the reason I went into the complexity sciences is just because I did find social science limited. Yeah. I did find that, that they sort of, in the absence of in the aftermath of the critique of Parsons, sociology threw the systems baby out with the bathwater and had not been thinking about, complex systems. And it was really the physicists and the mathematicians and the computer scientists who found effective ways to model those systems. It wasn't that suddenly the world discovered that was complex. It was these were methods that were providing tools. And they're endemic now to social science as well, from networks to simulation, microsimulation, agent-based modeling, differential equation modeling, right? You can't get away from these methods. And that's not because the social scientists developed them. They come from the hard sciences and from computational sciences. So I agree. I think a lot of the complexity we're up against requires those models. But at the same time, to push back, I think Lasse's critique stands as well, that if you're not trained in social science, you may oftentimes invent something you think is new, but it's already been there. And so I think the book tries to walk, and I have in my career tried to walk, I think, that line of knowing when I don't know something and I need the hard sciences, because, as you said, the problem is too serious for just a social scientist.
Thank you. So actually, we will go back later to discuss later the methodological problems. But now I would like to ask something which was new for me. I am somewhat uneducated and I didn't see clearly. So could you discuss the dichotomy of the sociological social psychology as opposed to a psychological social psychology. I didn't have this deep knowledge, so it was very interesting for me and hopefully also for the listener of this podcast. So
yeah. So if you go to Wikipedia, for those listening, and type in social psychology, at least English-speaking Wikipedia, you'll get a sociological version of social psychology and a psychological version. So even literally in Wikipedia, it exists. The difference is subtle, but it means everything. A psychological social psychology places the individual at the center. So let's say we're talking about Lasse and the world that Lasse lives in. I'm, as a psychological social psychologist, going to study how does the world impact Lasse, his thoughts, his values, his views, his beliefs, his behaviors. Sociological social psychology starts with the three of us interacting. And the world that emerges out of that social interaction, because there is no such thing as an individual being influenced by their environment. There are individuals in interaction, making and being influenced by their environment. And this is what allows sociological social psychology to bring in social structure, because social structure then becomes a manifestation of individuals interacting, but at the same time, those individuals interacting within a larger social system or social network of interaction. And if you actually look at the definition of social networks when created by sociologists, right, they were called structural sociologists, specifically because if they took a role like husband or friend or parent, they were roles that were defined through what you do, how you interact. And so it's just that slight turn, Peter, that places the interaction as the focal point. And it means everything in terms of what is your goal with your analysis. Now, the psychological social psychology, if your goal is to do therapy, you might then only talk to the individual. So I worked, as Peter and Lasse know, I was trained as a clinical psychologist. I would work with people who came in for inpatient addiction treatment. They would tell me a story about their life. And then after 2 weeks, their partners would come in and they'd say, I bet you so-and-so said this or that. Well, let me tell you a different story about their lives. And it was when I realized, and that's where family systems therapy comes from too, is that there's lots of narratives that are competing with each other and bouncing into each other. And then that means that when you move from one context to the next, who you are becomes different. And so it's all those subtleties that really play out. Neither is better than the other. It's a different way of thinking about how an individual becomes who they are.
Thank you. Lasse, any comments on Brian's nice
summary? No, I'm not I'm not a psychologist or a therapist or anything, and I also don't think I should be one. So I'll leave that to Brian.
So that is his business and you accept it.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So
pays me well for therapy too.
I would like to switch to the concept of dynamical social psychology. I have a somewhat different opinion, as you mentioned in your first sentence. You told that dynamical social psychology is an extension of the dynamical system theory approach to human psychology. And my answer is not, so why extension? Why not application? So you just an editor, I would have suggested to use.
Yeah, that would have been better. I think you're right.
Of course, I know the book of Andrzej Nowak and Robin Wallacher, is Dynamical Social Psychology and Dynamical Systems in Social Psychology. Go back now, now slowly 30 years old now. So how do you see, I think that was a book, trying to tell psychologists there is a movement of dynamical systems. The book itself contained chapters, but it was not very technical, but probably it was too technical for the psychologists. So how do you see these one or two books retrospectively now that was published in 1994, 1998? still it is important, or is there anything which survived? So I do believe yes, but how do you feel yourself?
Yeah, I think that, so a couple comments on it. I think, first of all, that,
Apology. Also,
you know,
could you speak also about the limitations, what you wrote in the chapters for limitations?
yeah, so I think that's right at the beginning of the book chapter. I think we try to get into this issue. I think the challenge is that dynamical systems theory, right, requires you to have some facility with differential equations and to work with that type of mathematical framing, which can be quite a challenge. Which is why at the beginning of that chapter, we spent some time really going through what does it mean to talk about a phase space, what is actual a discrete differential equation versus a dynamic or continuous differential equation, and really sort of explain these terms, Peter. So I think part of the big challenge has been just that. And as you know, as a mathematician yourself, the challenge with a lot of these models
I'm
is
just a humble chemist by formal training.
But you're a hell of a good mathematician too. I've read your math
I have
books.
good friends, good mathematicians friend.
There you go. So yeah, same here. You know, I got Rajiv Rajaram to do the work for me as far as that goes. I think that so I think that can be off-putting and challenging for people who aren't trained in it. Secondly, I think then the models themselves present a certain rigidity. I mean, I work in transport theory and dynamical systems theory with Rajiv, and the models can be difficult, you know, to apply to very complex processes. So I think part of the challenge has also been they tend to go for the simpler sorts of relationships that they can identify, which then I think can limit the work into only touching on certain things. And we found that, and I think in a number of the chapters, is that we were almost limited, right, Lasse, in what we sort of could say, because we wanted to be honest with the reader, like, this field's not progressing very far. So I do, no disrespect to their work, but I do feel as if it has not gone as far as it could. However, to answer the second part of your question, I think Wolfgang Tascher, who Lasse can speak to, I think he's doing really good work and really pushing the field forward. He has not written books that I know of, but certainly a number of really good articles, and he was working with Prigogine, right, Lasse, for a while, or
no, with Haken.
Hagen.
Yeah.
So
synergetics,
yeah, synergetic stuff, and I've used synergetics in my work as well. So I think that would be somebody that I would recommend to take a look at.
So are we in the situation that we might be able to assign formal computational models to social psychological phenomena? And does it help social psychologists? How do you feel? Brutally oversimplifying, yes or no?
I think, to be provocative back, I do think they tend to be oversimplified. And you know, again, I think that if you could pair up system dynamics or dynamical systems modeling, if you could pair it up with other methods, I think that would be the way out. I mean, synergetics is great. I mean, the idea of finding low-level patterns that are consistent out of high dynamic, lower micro scale phenomenon is very useful to identify trajectories and the way in which things are transported across time, even if it's metaphorically transporting the idea of ideas or opinions or views or beliefs. So again, I use these tools. We've used them to look at the relationship between comorbid depression and physical health across time and cohorts in Australia. We've used it to study allostatic load, which are biological markers for stress in humans. So I'm not saying it's not workforce or workhorse able, but we do use it in conjunction with other methods. Because I think, and Lasse, you could jump in on this, is the issue of perturbation that these models, they need to be perturbated. They need noise. And I can't think right now, my brain, Lasse, who's the urban planner who does work with differential equations, but he'll put noise in them. My brain's going down right now.
Lasse?
I love that. So now suddenly I need to open my mental library to see, to try and guess whose Brian is referring to. But to go back one step there and buying myself some thinking time to whoever the urban planner.
Yeah, thank you.
Brian was trying to
Michael Batty
out of UCL. Yeah, certainly. So, but there's another thing that I would like then to highlight here is that again, I'm not a psychologist. I've not been trained as such. So my reading is from an amateur perspective, and then I test things with Brian, and he tells me where I'm wrong and when I'm wrong. So a lot. But going into the work of Carl Jung, who's a psychologist that I do admire, I do see that in that work there are aspects, mechanisms, ideas that do resonate with the complexity sciences and with cybernetics. There's definitely the idea of emergence, because there's emergent behaviors and the conditions under which certain emergent behaviors may or may not be actualized. There is the idea of attractors, which is all around archetypes. There is definitely, he writes up what we would call feedback loops, but reinforcing mechanisms, reinforcing stimuli. So all these aspects are in that work, but it does not lean itself for equations, but it's there. So you read that, and as an amateur, again, I'm a real amateur in this field. But I'm absolutely satisfied with just reading it qualitatively and seeing it there. I don't feel the need to capture it into models.
Yeah. So thank you. And I think we will turn maybe to the most interesting part of our discussion, the social movements, predictability and controllability. And as you wrote, another distinguishing feature of social movements is that as an evolving and unfolding complex systems, they don't have control over the process of their own change. Apologies, I mentioned my own interest, but I wrote a little about this problem in my
Just a little bit.
book. How much social unrest do we need? Obviously, a total silent society is dead, and too much social unrest when you are not able to go to the city is also not good. Okay, that is, of course, I write more about this problem in the feedback book, but now we are discussing your book and not mine. So social movements, predictability and controllability. Brian and Lasse, the ball is again on your court.
Well, now this is where Lasse is the expert, so.
Yes,
I'm not sure.
Your decision.
I mean, first of all, it's a very hard code to crack, and I don't think that we have yet found the one and all solution that explains everything there. I do sense, as all of us do at this current point in time, that certain movements are self-perpetuating. They have built within them feedback mechanisms that reinforce it, even to such extent that if you ask individuals, they themselves may be shocked about the things that they say, the things that they do. Whereas once they are in the group, it makes total sense to them. We see this with the emergence now in many parts in Europe of far right. These are elements that for many years were not present, or they were marginalized because of the history that we have in the continent. And somehow the lid is off again. And that is a very interesting aspect. I think as an individual, no one longs back for the days of the Third Reich. But still, lots of people in a group all of a sudden subscribe to some of those aspects. They may not be they may not like dictators, but they will definitely together in a group say what we need is a strong person, or usually a strong man, unfortunately, to lead us through the current chaos, which is indeed a dictatorship. But as a group, that's not experienced. But if you talk to them individually, then they will suddenly realize. And that's an interesting aspect that I find here, is that people sort of get drawn into it and then also float or move with that, and do things and say things that perhaps they would have thought unthinkable if they would really sit down and ask themselves whether they believe it is or not. And all of that is 100% complexity science, but also, and Brian knows this very well, we have to refer to the work of Niklas Luhmann, who highlighted a lot of these we call it groupthink. I mean, he didn't use that term as far as I know, but sort of groups being caught up in their own thoughts and losing touch with the world around them. It's called autopoiesis, is something that he had already highlighted. So at a group level, I can see this happening, and I do feel that complexity science have a lot to say about sort of this disconnect between the individual and the emergent group properties. It's not the final answer, obviously.
Yeah, Lasse, I know that Luhmann's basic theory and the application of system theory to societies, but what happened later? Is there any continuation of his approaches, or disappeared? How does it look now from retrospective?
I find that that's a really good question, and a very good. It's very good because I've been asking myself that question, and so no, there is not that much there, and in part that I think is due to two things. A vast majority of his work has never been translated, so unknown in the English-speaking world, and secondly, it is not easy to read and to understand. It is also work that is very much self-contained. So once you're in that work, you can work with it. But to connect that work to other theories and methods in particular is extremely hard. And I feel that this is where a lot of people may have given up. For me personally, I love the work of Luhmann, and I use it as a searchlight, but I do not connect it to a specific method, though there are a lot of elements that do resonate with what we're doing in terms of these self-perpetuating mechanisms and the positive feedback. So he just describes it, and we see it is there.
Thank you. So continuing this line, as you wrote yourself, it would be difficult to deny that the system theory has helped shape the study of collective behavior and social movements. But where we are now, we know there is now public policy theory and applications, evolutionary psychology, behavioral economics. And so where we are now?
Yeah, I mean, again, that's a very good question, and it always seems to me that there, and please, Brian, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it always seems to me that there's a lot of enthusiasm when thinking in terms of systems, but when the push comes to shove, it seems to be that many academics would actually atomize things anyway. They break it down in measurable, smaller aspects, micro aspects, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I understand it. The more you try to keep trace of things, to track and trace and map things, the more you're almost like intellectually forced to break down things into separate elements, the more you will lose also that systemic view. And I think that is where there's a very difficult game to play between these abstract terms, these abstract theories of systems, and these very atomic, measurable behaviors. And we've seen that in many places where things are broken down, put into silos, put into pillars, and then measured without understanding the wider environment.
I would like to ask you about the opinion dynamics models, but probably you are quite discontent. And you know that there is this famous electronic journal, Journal of Artificial Societies and Social Simulations. And in the last, I don't know, slowly 25 years, there is a family of models of opinion dynamics, which would be difficult to deny grew up from the hardcore physicist model, which is called the Ising model. So there are elements who are sitting in a grid, and their opinion is influenced by the effect of the neighbors. and it influences and it drives the whole dynamics. So as provocative, do you feel that these models don't give any new insight to the social behavior of individuals and the communities that they form? So how opinion dynamics, why are you so discontent with the models that we have?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll let Brian leave the trench first, and then I follow.
Yeah. So before we go to that, could I just go back quickly to build a bit on what Lasse was saying very fast, as far as where are things at? I think there's a lot of work. Castell's work around social movements is very good stuff, and the stuff that's built off of that. The other thing too is the work that people are doing. You mentioned behavioral economics and so forth, Peter. I think there's a lot of work now recognizing that social movements are deeply connected to the psychology of people and what they're feeling, thinking, and believing, going all the way back to Freud's civilization and its discontents, and this idea of how people deal with things in good times versus bad times. And so I think there's that interlinking. I think to then take that into the critique is that a lot of political science, I think, unfortunately, has fallen into the survey world, the survey research world, and basic models of opinion dynamics. And we've seen in recent elections, they can't predict anything. So I don't think the critique we're making is from a particular standpoint based on the way we're trained, but I think it's a critique saying these things are not actually accomplishing their work. So that's sort of the proofs in the pudding is, are these opinion dynamic models achieving the sort of results that they're promising? And I think there's been a lot of over promising based on the seduction of putting something into a model and building it up. And so, in work that I do, as Lasse and I do, is definitely around computational policy, computational public policy, and so forth. So we do use, again, it's coming from a place of using these things. So I think we work very hard in the book to not just give an opinion or a critique without it being based on, sort of a certain level of humility and practice. We've done this work. We've played with these models. We use this work to inform policymakers, whether in government, third sector, so forth. But we're aware of the fact that your model there's a great article, and I forget the person who wrote it, again, my brain, but it's the idea of where is the role of an opinion dynamics modeler in the overall policy process or in the overall process of decision-making. And oftentimes modelers put themselves at the center when more often they're on the periphery. And these models are built, but they're not necessarily used correctly, or they're not understood, or they're over-relied upon. So I think our critique, Peter, would come more from a contextualized perspective of saying, it's not the model itself that's the problem, it's how it's used.
So,
yeah, no, go ahead, Peter.
Lasse, any comment on it?
No, I was just going to say that I agree, which is of course the safest option. But just to add one more thing to it is what we're seeing in today's world is the volatility of attitudes, and that volatility pitched against, I think, what people still have in terms of very fundamental normative beliefs. And so there's a huge scope there in terms of defining the hysteresis that is happening there, define the tipping points and the hysteresis in that. And so there's definitely a role there for those models. I do agree. They will have to be much more sophisticated also. So in addition to what Brian said, not just the context and the utility of those models, which is definitely one aspect, but also the sophistication of those models.
So thank you. And I think that slowly we should jump to the conclusions. We always need conclusions, of course, and some take-home message of the people. Thank for all of you who are watching this podcast. The Atlas is a huge book, and these two podcasts was able to reflect on a very small portion of the book. So I suggest all of you to take more time with the other aspects and other parts of the book. But now, both of you, could you tell conclusions and take-home messages in several sentences? 5 sentences for each. I will not be very rigid.
Yeah, at least it's not 5 words. And mind you, that our concluding chapter is called The Unfinished Space.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
we push against conclusion. Lasse, you want to go first? Or?
Yeah, Brian lets me do this part. So the conclusion of the entire book, Peter, I mean, it consists of different parts, so every part has its own conclusion. But if you were forcing me to do it in 5 sentences, I would say the conclusion is that we're currently at a place that is extremely exciting, that we're scratching the surface of, as we've been doing in social science for a century. But we're moving forward. I do have a great sense of progression there, which is what we're trying to capture in that book. But yes, the last sentence of the book is literally about, we are here and we need to keep moving forward, or moving on in time. I'm not quite sure what the exact phrase was there, but that is definitely where we're coming from, encouraging people to push further and not give up. That's more than 5 sentences, I'm afraid, Peter.
Still, it's manageable. So,
Okay, Brian can do it in 5, I'm sure.
So,
yeah.
Who will tell the very final words, Brian or Lasse, or both of you in a choir?
I'll just read it. The last words that Lasse wrote: do color outside of it. We must be comfortable with working in the ever-expanding interspace, going further, further, and further, and.
Thank you. I enjoyed very much the conversation with you. And
Same here. Thank you.
The 2 parts. And thank you.